This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. My buddy Jake Loosemore had a trio gig with a band made up of 4 people the other day at a little kind of local pub restaurant type thing the other day. It's called the Firehouse next to. They make really good pizzas. I'd say maybe it's like a sort of, you get like 50 people in the downstairs bar. There's like an outside bit. Small stage, but you know, you can fit stuff on there. And he took the most ridiculous rig that the place has ever seen. I think that's confirmed at this point. Forgot to press record, didn't I? Anyway, and so it was a 2-rock silver sterling signature and a Fender Vibroverb 64 reissue, and obviously his pedal boards, and he was running that as a dual amp setup. In the room, the difference between, I've been in the room obviously with modelling gear as well, and when you hear someone playing with modelling gear, I tend to think you don't get a sound that fills up the room quite as much as this. I think this is the perfect scenario for which I'm pretty sure an amp will always be the best solution. Anytime, you know, I'll be gigging at a pub, like club, something like this, I would almost always favour taking an amp, just because size is a factor. So taking a modeler for me on the floor, you have a bit more stuff on the floor, and then you maybe take a cab as well. But also the house PAs in these types of places generally can be a little bit iffy. You might have a sound person, you might not. The other scenario where I'd always think that you probably want to be using an amp is if the other guitarist in your band, if you've got 2 guitarists, is using a real amp. And now let me know your experience on this, but I read quite often that people trying to keep up with a real amp with a modelling setup, like traditional kind of modelling with an FRFR or something like that, oftentimes will struggle
I think generally the real amp is going to sound more natural. For me, the sound of FRFR speakers generally, it's a bit more of that hi-fi thing and a little bit of a smaller kind of sound in some ways, because typically the amps that I use in general will have an open back combo and they're chucking sound back at a pretty large rate as well. I think it's something about a guitar speaker, something about a guitar combo speaker disperses sound completely differently to an FRFR type speaker. Even the power cabs, because they're closed back, react a bit differently. So what I found works best for me is a hybrid situation where I'm using a modeler, but I'm also using an amp with a real cab, or like an FX return type situation. That's what I've found most enjoyable. But I still don't think it's quite as fun as a real amp. I've got some clips from the night which I wanted to drop in here. So Jake called me up to play on a couple of tunes. All that I had, he had actually, because he borrowed this off of me. Obviously he didn't bring 2 pedal boards because that would be crazy. He had this Angry Driver that he borrowed off me. Now I wouldn't recommend this pedal as something to just try and wing it with, because they're a little bit complicated with the stacked pots and very difficult to see on stage. However, I did think, so it was just the Murphy Lab Les Paul into the Angry Driver, into the Vibroverb. And I have to say, I don't know, listening back to it, as good a tone as I've got with anything else without really any tweaking. And that's another thing that the amp thing, I feel like, is quicker, right? I don't know, you set up an amp, you set up your pedals, plug them in, perfectly good to do that kind of jam situation. One amp, one pedal, dial it in how you want. I think the amp was just on 3, and then you turn up the drive or turn down the drive. It's kind of a simple situation, isn't it? Whereas with the modelling stuff, oftentimes I might have to sort of mess around with high cuts and bits and pieces like that. Also with the modelling stuff, because there's delay and reverb available, I'm going to use them, and maybe not always to the benefit of the tone live. For me, I think there's always going to be, in this real specific spot, a huge space for a guitar amp to actually be, assuming that the sound person doesn't slap you around the face and say, why have you brought an amp to this gig? Wedding situations and functions, I think, is where people are most resistant these days to a real amp. Typically because some of these venues will have sound limiters. And in that case, I think it's really easy to get lost as a guitarist, because you're competing then in the PA with kick drum, if they've got that through, with bass, with vocalists, with keyboard. And for me, I think that is a really easy way to get completely lost as a guitarist, because the sound person is kind of focusing on everything else. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you still use an amp for certain situations? That's one for me where I would always favour an amp if I'm playing in a smaller venue, jam type scenario, maybe sort of funkier, bluesier, jammier stuff. I'm not going to take a modeler to that situation. It just doesn't seem to work as well. So pubs, little clubs, that sort of venue. Of course, massive stages is a little bit less of a thing, right? It's more likely that you're going to be using in-ear setups or full monitoring setups anyway, in which case the front of house is doing most of the heavy lifting. It doesn't matter so much if you're going digital or using a real amp. I think loads of bands these days just go for the digital setup. I don't think it's to the benefit of the audience in most cases. So the stuff that I've seen, like Sleep Token Live, who I think use Kempers, may have moved to Quad Cortex or something now, but I couldn't really hear the guitars at all in that sort of setup. And when I've seen guitarists using digital rigs in a pub setup, I've never really been that impressed and thought the guitar didn't cut through too much or enough at all. So I think in that case, maybe the guitar speaker is crucial, maybe really important. I've got some other clips of my modeling stuff live, which I'll maybe drop in here as well. See if you think there's a difference in tone, or whether you prefer one or the other. Leave some comments if you want. But that for me is why the amp is not dead. So I think as long as these types of smaller little gigs are around, I think the amp really, the people that are playing those gigs, I think are going to go for an amp. I think Rob Harris from Jamiroquai, I heard on his podcast, he was saying that he uses an amp for this sort of situation where he's maybe just showing up to a gig. I think if you don't have time for a sound check and some of these things, using a modeler in these situations can be a bit of a risk, maybe. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Have a good week.